Iran Daily Briefing, Wednesday, May 27, 2026. Iranian negotiators were in Qatar, and U.S. Iran talks were ongoing there when the U.S. military carried out strikes in southern Iran on May 25. France 24, the BBC, and NPR all report that the strikes came as diplomacy continued. Washington says the attacks were self-defense. Tehran says they violated the ceasefire. Today's briefing is about that overlap. Talks in Qatar, strikes near the Strait of Hormuz, and the military and political signals now shaping the next phase. Today is Wednesday, May 27, 2026. The central issue is not one event. It is the combination of events. Negotiations are continuing. Iran says a framework is being finalized. The United States says its military action was defensive. Iran says the same action breached a ceasefire. This is also unfolding alongside pressure in other files. France 24 and Al Monitor report on Israeli operations in Lebanon linked in reporting to Hezbollah. The BBC reports that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to crush Hezbollah, described in that reporting as Iran-backed. Al Jazeera reports that disruption in the Strait of Hormuz linked to the Iran war has fed food security concerns in Europe, and that the European Union has launched a fertilizer plan. Following up on yesterday's episode, several claims we flagged as unresolved now have partial updates. The May 25 U.S. strikes are now reported by France 24, the BBC, NPR, DW, CNBC, and Global Security, with U.S. Central Command saying they were self-defense strikes. The Iranian claim that it downed a U.S. drone remains reported by the BBC as Iran's claim. The supplied intelligence does not include independent confirmation. The Strait of Hormuz reopening plan remains unresolved in official terms. France 24 reports that the strait is still a sticking point, while Middle East Eye reports a sanctions waiver formulation that has not been confirmed by both governments. On the nuclear file, France 24 reports that Trump was moving toward Iran's position regarding destruction of enriched uranium, but the intelligence available here does not include the full negotiating language. In this episode, the U.S. strikes during the Qatar talks, Iran's negotiating position, the Strait of Hormuz file, Iranian military preparations, the partial restoration of internet access, and the Lebanon front. The top story today is the overlap between U.S.-Iran diplomacy and U.S. military strikes. France 24 reports that peace negotiations involving Iran and the United States were ongoing in Qatar at the time of the May 25 strikes. The BBC reports that Iranian negotiators were in Doha for peace talks when the strikes took place. NPR reports that the U.S. military struck Iranian boats and missile launch sites while envoys continued negotiations to end a 3-month war. The U.S. position is that the strikes were defensive. France 24 reports that U.S. Central Command said it conducted self-defense strikes in southern Iran on May 25. The BBC reports the same formulation. U.S. Central Command said the strikes targeted missile sites and boats and were carried out in self-defense. France 24 reports that Washington said attacks near the Strait of Hormuz targeted missile sites and vessels allegedly laying mines. Iran's position is different. France 24 reports that Iran accused the United States on Tuesday of breaching a ceasefire with strikes near the Strait of Hormuz. The BBC reports that Iran condemned the strikes as a gross violation of a ceasefire. Al Jazeera reports that Iranian officials said the latest U.S. strikes validated their skepticism toward the United States and strengthened their resolve to stand firm on demands. That is the immediate collision in the record. Washington describes a defensive military action. Tehran describes a breach of the ceasefire. Negotiators were still engaged. The diplomatic track has not disappeared. France 24 reports that a top Iranian official delegation in Qatar said it was finalizing a 14-point framework for a deal to end the war. France 24 previously reported that Washington and Tehran were managing expectations around a final deal or memorandum of understanding, with key details still unresolved. U.S. President Donald Trump said on social media that negotiations with Iran were proceeding nicely. France 24 also reports that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio maintained that a deal with Iran could be reached within days. Al Jazeera adds an important detail on Iran's internal process. It reports that Iran's negotiators follow a mandate set by the Supreme National Security Council and that Iran's supreme leader approves that mandate. That matters because the Iranian delegation's room for movement is presented in the reporting as bounded by decisions made in Tehran. The supplied intelligence does not give the full contents of the mandate. It does show that Iranian officials are placing the talks within a formal decision structure. Several issues are now visible in the talks. France 24 reports that Iran asked for the unfreezing of Iranian funds as part of a deal. It also reports that issues involving the Strait of Hormuz are among the sticking points. Iran says Tehran's sovereignty over the strait would be an essential component of a deal. On the nuclear file, France 24 reports that President Trump was moving toward Iran's position regarding the destruction of enriched uranium. But the intelligence available here does not include the full negotiating language. Xinhua, reported via Global Security, separately says Trump said on May 25 that Iran's enriched uranium would be destroyed after being handed over. Crypto Briefing reports that Iran was weighing the option of shipping 60% enriched uranium to China amid negotiations with the United States. That latter claim is single source in today's intelligence. China's position also appears in the record. IRNA, reported by Mehr News Agency, says a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said on Tuesday that Beijing is willing to continue playing a constructive role in the political and diplomatic resolution of the Iranian nuclear issue. There is also political pressure in Washington. NPR reports that an emerging deal to end the war with Iran has exposed President Trump to criticism. NPR also reports that Trump would meet with his cabinet on Wednesday during talks aimed at ending the war with Iran. For Tehran, the latest strikes are now part of the negotiating atmosphere. Al Jazeera reports that Iranian officials said the attacks validated their skepticism. France 24 reports that Iran warned it was ready to retaliate after overnight U.S. strikes. For Washington, the military line remains the self-defense justification. France 24. The BBC and Global Security all report that U.S. Central Command described the May 25 strikes in those terms. The concrete thing to watch is public language from the Qatar channel, whether Iran continues to say the 14-point framework is being finalized, and whether Washington continues to describe the May 25 strikes only as self-defense while talks continue. The first developing story is the Strait of Hormuz file. France 24 reports that Iran says sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz would be an essential component of a deal. France 24 also reports that strait-related issues are among the sticking points in U.S. Iran talks. Middle East Eye reports that Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for a sanctions waiver on oil sales under the deal being discussed. That formulation is single source in today's intelligence and has not been confirmed by both governments. This follows the unresolved item from yesterday's look ahead. Nikki had reported, citing a Middle East diplomatic source, that Washington and Tehran were discussing a plan to open the strait about 30 days after a deal, with Iran clearing mines during that window. Today's supplied intelligence does not confirm that plan through both governments. Instead, it adds a separate Middle East Eye report about a sanctions waiver, also not confirmed by both governments. The Strait file is now tied to both military and economic reporting. France 24 reports that Washington said its attacks near the strait targeted missile sites and vessels allegedly laying mines. Al Jazeera reports that disruption in the strait linked to the Iran war has fueled food security fears in Europe. Al Jazeera also reports that the European Union launched a fertilizer plan amid that disruption. Insurance Journal reports that hundreds of British sailors were aboard the RFA Lime Bay off Gibraltar, awaiting possible deployment for a mine-clearing mission to the Strait of Hormuz. The thing to watch is whether either Washington or Tehran publicly confirms any specific strait formula, sovereignty language, sanctions waiver terms, reopening sequencing, or mine-clearing arrangements. The second developing story is recent public military messaging from Tehran. France 24 reports that the deputy political chief of Iran's Revolutionary Guard said on Wednesday that the possibility of a renewed war with the United States was low. Al Jazeera reports that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said a new U.S. attack was unlikely, that it was ready to repel any attacks, and that it attributed the unlikelihood of new fighting to enemy weakness. At the same time, France 24 reports that the same Revolutionary Guard official said Iran's armed forces were lying in wait with full magazines against any future attacks. Mehr News Agency and IRNA report that Iran's armed forces spokesperson said on May 26 that any new attack by the United States or Israel would trigger a very devastating Iranian response. They also report that the spokesperson said Iran's retaliation would involve surprise tactics. France 24 adds a separate military preparedness item. It reports that Iran's military forces are deploying more man-portable air defense systems in preparation for a potential new round of U.S.-Israeli attacks. Man-portable air defense systems are shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons. France 24 says it obtained documents and videos showing mass training by the Revolutionary Guards for members of the Basij on how to fire those systems. France 24 describes the Basij as the IRGC's paramilitary force. France 24 reports that the preparations drew on lessons from the recent war and the downing of multiple US and Israeli aircraft. There are two tracks in that messaging. Iranian officials say renewed war is unlikely. They also say Iran is preparing for future attacks and warning of retaliation. The thing to watch is whether Iranian military statements continue to pair low war probability language with readiness and retaliation language, especially after the US strikes. The third developing story is internet access inside Iran. France 24 reports that Iranian authorities on Tuesday partially restored internet access after an almost 3-month nationwide shutdown. The BBC reports that internet access had started coming back after a months-long blackout. The BBC also reports that internet access in Iran had been cut off since the start of the war in late February. France 24 reports that the nationwide shutdown was imposed during the war with Israel and the United States. It says home broadband connections resumed in some areas after the partial restoration, but mobile internet remained largely blocked. France 24 also reports that many Iranians remained reliant on VPNs to access international websites and social media. Middle East Eye reports that Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian ordered the reopening of international internet access, according to state media reports on Monday. The immediate picture is partial restoration, not full restoration. Some home broadband has resumed. Mobile internet remains largely blocked. Many users still rely on VPNs. The thing to watch is whether mobile internet restrictions ease and whether international websites and social media become accessible without VPNs. The fourth developing story is Lebanon. France 24 reports that Israel said it was intensifying operations despite a truce with the Iran-backed group Hezbollah. The BBC reports that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to crush Hezbollah, which the BBC described as Iran-backed. Al Jazeera reports that Israeli strikes in Lebanon occurred as ceasefire tensions rose during the Iran war. France 24 and Al Monitor described Hezbollah as an Iran-backed group in reporting on Israeli operations in southern Lebanon. The BBC reports that Israel described Hezbollah as Iran-backed in the context of strikes in Lebanon. The significance for this briefing is the link in reporting between Lebanon operations and Iran's regional position. The supplied intelligence does not show a new Iranian statement on Lebanon today. It does show that the Lebanon file is moving in parallel with the U.S.-Iran talks and with the military messaging from Tehran. The thing to watch is whether Israeli statements continue to link operations in Lebanon to Hezbollah and whether Iranian officials respond directly in the context of the broader war talks. The fuller picture from the cold open is this. Iranian negotiators were in Doha for peace talks when the U.S. strikes took place, according to the BBC. France 24 reports that peace negotiations involving Iran and the United States were ongoing in Qatar at the time of the May 25th strikes. NPR reports that the U.S. military struck Iranian boats and missile launch sites while envoys continued negotiations. Washington says the strikes were self-defense. France 24 and the BBC report that U.S. Central Command used that description. France 24 reports that Washington said attacks near the Strait of Hormuz targeted missile sites and vessels allegedly laying mines. Tehran says the strikes violated the ceasefire. France 24 reports that Iran accused the United States of breaching the ceasefire. The BBC reports that Iran called the strikes a gross violation. Al Jazeera reports that Iranian officials said the strikes validated their skepticism toward the United States. The talks continued in the reporting. France 24 says a top Iranian official delegation in Qatar said it was finalizing a 14-point framework. Trump said negotiations were proceeding nicely. Rubio maintained that a deal could be reached within days. On the Strait, France 24 reports that Iran says sovereignty over the Strait would be an essential component of a deal. Middle East Eye reports that Iran would reopen the Strait in exchange for a sanctions waiver on oil sales. That formulation is single source in today's intelligence and has not been confirmed by both governments. In the next 24 to 48 hours, watch 4 items. First, watch the public language around the Qatar talks. France 24 reports that a top Iranian official delegation in Qatar said it was finalizing a 14-point framework for a deal to end the war. France 24 also reports that Trump said negotiations were proceeding nicely and that Secretary of State Marco Rubio maintained that a deal could be reached within days. Second, watch whether Washington and Tehran clarify the ceasefire dispute after the May 25th strikes. France 24 and the BBC report that U.S. Central Command described the strikes as self-defense. France 24 and the BBC also report that Iran accused the United States of violating the ceasefire. Third, watch the Strait of Hormuz terms. France 24 reports that Strait-related issues remain among the sticking points and that Iran says sovereignty over the Strait would be an essential component of a deal. Middle East Eye reports that Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for a sanctions waiver on oil sales under the deal being discussed. That formulation is single source in today's intelligence and has not been confirmed by Washington and Tehran. Fourth, watch Iran's domestic access restrictions. France 24 reports that internet access was partially restored on Tuesday, that some home broadband connections resumed, and that mobile internet remained largely blocked. The next visible marker is whether mobile access and international platforms open further or whether the restoration remains limited. Today's episode covered the U.S. strikes during ongoing U.S.-Iran diplomacy, the Strait of Hormuz negotiations, Iranian military messaging, partial internet restoration inside Iran, and Israeli operations in Lebanon, linked in reporting to Hezbollah. We'll be back tomorrow with the next Iran Daily Briefing. For full written briefs and source-backed updates, check out the Iran Brief on Substack. Paid members can build multi-country monitoring across the countries they care about, with personalized briefings delivered automatically.